everybody, welcome to CrazyTechLab. It's been a while, but we are back with an awesome video looking at how to apply a very simple overclock in just a couple of minutes to an Intel Core Ultra 200 series processor, specifically the Core Ultra 5245K, which is an overclockable processor. It's a K series one, so all you need is a Z890 motherboard enabled to be able to actually overclock it, and we are going to run through just a couple of settings, just two settings today that you need in order to actually overclock it. So this isn't a very complicated overclocking guide. It's very quick and easy to do. It's maybe not the most efficient way of overclocking your processor. There are better ways to get more performance for less power, more efficient ways, as I say, but that's not what this video is about today. As I've seen in my previous simple overclocking videos, you guys love these kind of things because it means that they're very easy to follow, even if they're only temporary, and you can see more performance for free, which is what overclocking is all about, really. So what I don't want to see are the comments saying, oh, you shouldn't overclock this way, there are better ways of doing it. Yeah, there are, if you tweak more settings, but that's not what this guide is about today. There are loads of other guides out there that go into more detail, but if you just want to tweak just two settings, get more performance for free, and potentially a cooler running processor as well, because you can often undervolt these things while overclocking them, so your processor will actually run cooler than it does at stock speed, which is awesome, then that is what this video is about today. So you can see all the hardware that we're going to be using in this video in the description down below. There are links that go onto Amazon, and I just receive a little bit of a cutback from those to help keep the channel going. We are going to be using the MAG Z890 Tomahawk Wi-Fi motherboard, which is what we've got here. So thanks MSI for sending this over and for sponsoring today's video as well. And this motherboard I actually saw being built in the factory in China at MSI's factory. So definitely check out that awesome video where you can see how a motherboard is actually put together on a conveyor belt going through their factory. It's really awesome, so definitely check out in the description down below as well. Processor that we're going to be using, as I mentioned earlier, is the Core Ultra 5245K. So this thing can manage around 4.7 gigahertz in all-core workloads out of the box. We are going to be trying to get that up to at least 5.3, 5.4, maybe even a bit higher in this video today. So a huge overclock that should result in plenty of extra performance, and as I mentioned, we might even be able to rein in the thermals compared to stock speed as well. So an awesome video here today. Thanks for MSI for sponsoring it. Thanks for Intel, or to Intel, for sending over the Core Ultra 5245K, and you can check out all the links to all the important stuff down in the description down below, including links to my Amazon shop where you can actually buy a lot of the hardware that I review on the channel that I've tried and tested, and I haven't just bunged it in a pretty PC and thrown it your way. I've actually tried and tested it and compared it, more importantly, to other products first. And if you found this video really informative, you can even buy me a coffee in the link down in the description down below as well. So that's it for the intro. Let's crack on with the overclocking guide.
Now, before we start our overclocking, we need to carry out a bit of pre-tweaking testing just to make sure that our system is up for a little bit of increased heat and all that kind of stuff. So what we want to do is download 3 programs, that the only bits that we need to run all of the testing here today. And the first one over on the left is CoreTemp. This is all of the software is freely downloadable, by the way. And all the links you can find in the description down below as well. And while you're down there, why not click on the subscribe button and like this video, and even send me a comment as well on this guide when you've finished it today. And CoreTemp basically gives us the readout of every single core on the processor. So we've got a whole bunch of performance cores and efficient cores under the hood. I think it's 6 performance cores and 8 efficient cores on this particular processor. So we've got all of those listed, and we'll just want to keep an eye on those, and also see the how much the temperatures increase by as we apply the overclocks as well. So I'm using custom liquid cooling in my system, but I've run the same tests on standard liquid coolers and I get pretty much the same results. It's a fairly easy processor to test, and it doesn't really get that hot anyway. If you have a high-end air cooler, you should be fine, and even mid-range air coolers should be absolutely fine to do this testing as well. But just make sure that things aren't getting too toasty and hitting, you know, like 90, 95 degrees under load, especially before we start. So if you're running something very small, you might want to consider upgrading your cooler before you do this. But this is a great way to start because we can see what our cooling is actually capable of. The second bit of software is CPU-Z or CPU-Z. And this is a great little program because it shows you all sorts of stuff about your processor. And if you right click on the core speed down here, it actually lists the current frequency of all of the cores. Now you can see here that they're labeled P-core and E-core as well, which is really handy. So we can see the different frequencies because we will be applying different frequencies to those different types of cores. And we'll want to have a look at that while we're running the test in a minute. Final bit of software is one of my favorite benchmarking programs. It is Cinebench, and it is the R24 version, 2024 version. And what we want to do first is just knock this back to off because we just want to get a score at stock speed and just see what the temperatures are. It runs long enough for us to get a good idea about what the temperatures are at stock speed, and they won't really increase that much if we ran this 10-minute stress test, to be honest. So let's go ahead and run the multi-core test. And as we can see down here, we've got a couple of figures that we need to look at. So first and foremost, the frequencies. So we've got a figure of 5,000 megahertz for the performance cores, and 4.6 gigahertz or 4,600 megahertz for the E cores, and we're going to be increasing both of those by quite a bit in the overclocking. Now the voltage that we've got for this load test here is 1.174 volts. So as long as we stay within 0.1 of a volt of that, we should be fine. So up to about 1.28, 1.3 volts is absolutely fine. And what we won't be doing in the either of the overclocking methods is increasing the voltage past that or applying a manual overclock. We're going to do things slightly differently this time, which we'll have a look at in a minute when we go into the EFI. So what we're going to do now is just kick back, see what the final temperatures are and the result as well. So here we are at the end result then, and we have a score of 1,481 points. We obviously want to see that increase. I want to see it well into the 1,500s once we finished. And temperatures, very, very acceptable here. We are looking at about 64 degrees peak temperature on any of the cores. So as long as your temperature is below sort of 75, 80 degrees when you start this, there should be plenty of headroom. I can tell you now that we don't really see temperatures climb much more than 10 degrees or so above where they are here, sort of 10 to 15 degrees, which is absolutely fine. So what we're going to do now is head into the EFI, and we're going to start our first session of overclocking. Okay, so we are now in the EFI, and if you don't know how to get here, what you need to do is to restart your PC, and when the screen goes black, you can just tap the delete key repeatedly until you get to a page that looks like this. Now this is the MSI BIOS or EFI, and we're going to be doing stuff in here. Now you can apply these settings on other boards, but I can't guarantee that they will be stable because motherboards tend to do slightly different things. But if you have an MSI motherboard, in particular a Z890 or Z890 motherboard, then you'll be able to do this. You will not be able to overclock your processor if you have a B series motherboard, such as B860 or something like that. You need a Z series motherboard. Now, for the first step, what we need to do is to make sure that the memory XMP profile is enabled. It should be, whether you've built a PC or whether you've bought it, it should be enabled because this will ensure that your memory is running at its rated speed. If it's not applied, and then you do an overclock, and then you apply it afterwards, that can sometimes trip up the overclock. It can put more stress on the processor, and you might think that it's your memory that's a problem, whereas actually your overclock is too much for your system when it's actually got the memory running at its rated speed. You should always start with the XMP profile loaded first and then move on to an overclock. So just make sure that the XMP profile is loaded here and doesn't look like this, which is standard. So we need the memory, the XMP profile to be loaded first. So that's step one. Step two is to go into the advanced section and then find overclocking, and then we have all our wonderful settings here to start our tweaking. Now I'm going to do this overclocking guide in two steps with two different overclocks. The first one, we are going to be sticking to just two settings, and this time compared to some of my previous overclocking guides, we are going to be tweaking the performance core frequency and the E-core frequency. So why the reason why I'm doing this, rather than just tweaking the P cores and maybe the voltage, which is what I've done in previous Intel-based guides, is because you can see slightly more of a benefit with Arrow Lake and the Core Ultra series processors by tweaking the E cores as well. And also during my testing today, I've found that you can actually push the processor quite a way without even having to touch the voltage. Now, the motherboard will actually open the taps a little bit once you start playing with multipliers. We'll see the MSI performance preset up here actually switched to MSI extreme settings or something like that, which basically means it can provide the processor with a little bit more power. The benefit of that is that we don't need to tweak anything else, and you don't need to either. We can just increase the P-core ratio a little bit, the E-core ratio a little bit to get higher frequencies on both of those types of cores, and then we can just exit and see how everything goes in Windows, so which is great. Very, very simple, and I just like keeping that first step to just 2 settings. Now, I have found that the processor can actually overclock a little bit more than the motherboard's extreme settings allow. So what I've done is we're going to be running through a second overclocking method, basically, which is increasing those frequencies a little bit further, but using what is called an offset voltage. Now, in the past, I've used manual voltages, which apply a fixed voltage to the processor, which is enabled all of the time. That's very simple to do, but it also means that the processor is running at a higher voltage and is drawing more power and generating more heat all of the time, some of it unnecessarily. So the offset voltage basically only applies that voltage when the processor is under load. When it's not under load, it kicks back, it goes back into idle, and you save power and thermals. So that's a more efficient way of doing it, but it involves tweaking 5 settings or thereabouts rather than just 2. So you can understand why I've been reluctant to do that in the past, because the whole idea about this guide is tweaking as few settings as possible and not making things scary, basically. But hopefully, with me explaining exactly what I'm doing by each and every individual step and providing an easy overclock and then a slightly more involved one, you can just pick whichever one you feel comfortable with. So the first thing we need to do is head down to the P-core ratio, and we can change that to 53. All right, so that will give us a P-core ratio of 5,300 megahertz or 5.3 gigahertz, and that is at least 300 megahertz higher than what we had before. Now, when we do this, as I mentioned earlier, the motherboard wants to open the taps a little bit to allow more voltage and power to go to the processor, and it will come up with this warning here. You just need to click OK on this one. All right, that's all you need to do. It's not going to break your motherboard. It doesn't apply anywhere near as much voltage to do that. It's literally increasing it by a tiny amount compared to stock speed. So we can see here that our 53 has turned into 5,300 megahertz below. So that's a nice bump in the P-core frequency. And we need to do the same for the E-core ratio, but with a slightly different figure. So we need to add in 48 there, and that will give us 4.8 gigahertz on the E-cores, which is a 200 megahertz increase. That is all we need to do in this setting. So what we can do now is press F10 and exit back to Windows and start testing. So we are back in Windows now, and we can notice here that the voltage of our processor has gone up a little bit compared to where it was at stock speed. So this is the motherboard doing its thing and providing our processor with a little bit more voltage. So we want to load up Cinebench and then disable the minimum test duration. We just want to get a score and have a quick stability test to make sure that everything's okay. And then what we can do is run the multi-core test and see what happens, essentially. So we can see the voltage has stayed the same, and our processor cores, as you can see here, the P cores are now running at 5.3 gigahertz, and that's a good 300 or 400 megahertz higher than we saw at stock speed. And then we have all of the E cores running at 4.8 or 4800 megahertz. Now, temperatures obviously a little bit higher than they were at stock speed, and we've topped 70 degrees already on a couple of the E cores down there, and they might increase a little bit more. As long as they remain sort of under 80 degrees here, it should be absolutely fine. And of course, if you've got a less powerful cooling, they might top 80 degrees, but it's nothing to worry about really. So this is the simple overclock. And what we're going to do now is just sit back and wait for the test to finish, and we can have a look at the final result, the temperatures as well that we'll need to consider at the end. So we've just finished our stress test, and if we look at the temperatures, we are peaking at around 74. So it's a noticeable uplift from where we were at stock speed, but not catastrophically so, and there's still plenty of room for some further tweaking. Now, the voltages and everything else, you can already see that the processor has kicked back to about 500 megahertz on occasions and dropped the voltage as well, so we don't need to worry about this drawing loads more voltage than it needs to. letting the motherboard do its own thing is probably applying a bit too much voltage to what we actually need, but it means that we just have to tweak two settings, the P core and the E cores. Now, as far as the result goes, that's obviously significantly higher than where we were. We were in the 1400s somewhere earlier. We are now at 1536. So that's the result that we've got for the first stage of our overclock, and we're now going to go back to the EFI to show you how to do something a little bit more involved. So we are back in the EFI, and the next thing we need to do is to play with our second overclock, which is a little bit more involved. And what we need to do here is to change the P-core ratio first. So we're going to dial that up to 54 to give us 5.4 gigahertz. So we're now 400 megahertz at least above where the processor was at stock speed. And we're also going to tweak the E-core ratio. We're going to bump that up another 100 megahertz to 4.9. So nice little increases there. Now, this is not stable. If you just go back into Windows now, it will not, or at least it wasn't stable on my processor. So what we need to do is to dial up the processor voltage a little bit. And the way that we are going to do that, once we've got down there's loads of settings to go through. We need to go to, let me just find it here, the P-core voltage mode. So we need to set this to offset mode, all right? And then the actual offset mode, we need to turn to positive. So we want to increase the voltage on occasions rather than subtract from the stock voltage. So we need to set that to positive. So offset mode in the P-core voltage mode, and then on the P-core voltage offset mode, we need to set that to positive to add voltage. Now down here, what we need to do is type in the voltage that we want to apply when the processor is under load. And by doing this, you don't type in the actual voltage, you type in what is called an offset. So it's how much voltage you want to add to the voltage that's already being applied to the processor. So in this case, we want to type 0.03. Now do not type 0.03, because if you do that, this happens. I've just typed in 0.03, okay, but it hasn't. It's typed in 10 times that amount of voltage, and it's done 0.3 instead. So make very sure that you type in the entire thing, because otherwise you'll be applying way too much voltage to your processor. Probably won't do it any long-term damage or short-term damage, any damage at all, but you definitely want to make sure that it's not 0.3 and it's 0.03. So make sure there is a 0 after that decimal point, and you want to see 2 zeros before the 3. Okay, as long as you make sure that's okay, then it's fine. So that is what it should look like. That is all we need to do. So we've tweaked an extra 3 settings down here. So 5 settings in total. Is a little bit more complicated, but it will allow us to get another extra 100 megahertz out of both the E cores and the P cores. So that is all we need to do. You can press F10 and then we can go back to Windows. Right, so we are back in Windows then after our final overclock, and we're going to run through our final Cinebench run. So to start with then, make sure that the minimum test duration is off, so we just get a score and have a bit of a test, and we can check our voltages and temperatures. So I'm going to click Start on that multi-core test, and as we can see, we've got a slightly higher voltage here, so it's 1.286 volts than we had last time, letting the motherboard do its own thing. But what we'll see hopefully in a minute is that voltage actually falling way down below 1 volt when the processor is idling, which is exactly what we want. So most of the time a lower voltage will be applied, but when the processor is under load, enough voltage is being applied to actually get us here. So the frequencies now, as you can see, we've now got 5.4 gigahertz across all of the P cores, and the E cores have increased by 300 megahertz up to 4.9 gigahertz. And the temperatures at the moment, because we have an offset voltage, sometimes what can happen with that is you end up with a slightly lower temperature because the processor is allowed to kind of go up and down the voltage scale as it sees fit, and it can actually result in a lower temperature than some other overclocks. So this is what we're dealing with here. So at the moment we have around 74 degrees as our peak temperature on one of the E cores, and we're just going to allow this to run through the test and get the result afterwards and see what the maximum temperatures were. Right, so we have our finished result and we can look over all of the things here. And first thing to note is that we have a much lower voltage here on the processor. You can see that things have kicked back in the frequency and the voltage, so there's no worrying about the voltage being too high over long periods. It will actually kick back to very low levels with an offset rather than a manual voltage, which is what we've gone with here. So the multi-core score in Cinebench is up even further. We're now at 15,067. 1567, and then I have actually seen slightly higher results than this, but we're going to run the gaming tests before we come to the conclusions at the end and we look at all the results. Temperatures, we have a peak of 76 degrees C, so even if you have a pretty small air cooler, you're probably going to be able to do this overclock as well. So obviously I recommend that you have a decent cooler with any processor if you're going to be overclocking. And these temperatures are, of course, a reasonable amount higher than where we were before, but we're just allowing this processor to stretch its legs and to make sure that everything is stable, and we are well south of 80 degrees on this overclock anyway. So what we can do next is run through the game tests and see the benefits of all our tweaking. Finally, we can check out the fruits of our efforts, and starting with Cinebench, we can see that the score has risen from 1481 up to 1536 with our first overclock, with the P cores at 5.3 and the E cores at 4.8, and that's 1536, and then it rises again to 1572 points, and that's with our 5.4 and 4.9 overclock at the end using the offset voltage. So we're nearly 100 points ahead of where we started. So that's a pretty good increase for anyone out there that's looking to get more performance for their multi-threaded workloads. Now for gaming, starting with Cyberpunk 2077, this was run at 1080p with ray tracing in Ultra and DLSS in balance mode with an RTX 4090. And we have a stock speed average frame rate of 208 frames per second. That rose to 217 with the 5.3 and 4.8 overclock, and then it rose a further 3 frames per second to with the 5.4, 4.9 overclock. So this is just a very small snapshot of what you might see in games. Some games might actually perform better if they're more CPU bound. Others you might not see much of a benefit. Switching over to Shadow of the Tomb Raider, 1080p at very high settings, and here we have 261 points starting off with, frames per second, 261 frames per second, not points, at stock speed, rising to 268 with the 5.3 and 4.8 overclock, and then finally to 270 frames per second on the average frame rate at 5.4 and 4.9. So some pretty significant gains there overall, and for not a lot of tweaking, and temperatures all well within limits, and very, very doable on pretty much any system out there that has half decent cooling. So that's it from the guide today. I hope you enjoyed it. If you've got any questions about it at all, please feel free to comment down below. Don't forget to like and comment down below. It just helps punch me through the algorithm and gets me noticed. And don't forget to subscribe as well. And obviously, if you want to take this further, you can. If you end up with 5.5 gigahertz, I'd love to hear about it, and equally you might be able to hit 5 gigahertz on the E-cores as well, depending on your chip. And of course, if you find that any of the settings don't work on your PC and Cinebench crashes, for example, just rein in those frequencies by 100 megahertz on both E-cores and P-cores, and then you should find that things become stable. But any problems, let me know in the comments down below as well. And also don't forget to subscribe to my channel. It means a lot to have your support, and obviously just gets me noticed and helps me keep running the channel. So thanks to MSI for sponsoring today's video, and we'll be back very, very soon.